Hi, my name's Elisa Lohit-Navi and I'm Image and Body Language Consultant based in Bangkok, Thailand.
And my name's Mike Carter. I'm a body language consultant based in the UK.
So Mike, I'm interested in talking about the cultural differences in body language.
So, Elisa, given that you are Thai, but were born and have lived outside of Thailand for quite some time, you will have been exposed to both Asian and Western cultures. So can you give me some examples of the types of body language that both cultures need to be aware of?
Well, Mike, you're right. I was born in Munich, Germany, grew up in Thailand, later in Australia. I've lived and worked in Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, and Vietnam. My exposure to different cultures due to work and extensive travels enabled me to understand the nonverbal cues of body language. I believe the world is getting smaller, and both cultures need to be aware of each other's body language in order not to misread or misrepresent it. For me, the most commonly mistaken body language between an Asian and a Westerner would be a handshake. Handshakes are not used in Asian cultures. In countries like Japan, Korea, and China, people tend to bow. And in countries like Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam, people tend to Y. A Y is when you press both palms together in a prayer-like manner and go like that. Westerners may find that when they extend their hands to Asian women, that they're not so responsive in extending their hands back or shaking the hands that have been extended to them. Sometimes the handshakes they get may just be a soft grip on the tip of their fingers. Handshakes with both Asian men and women tend not to be so strong, and strong handshakes can be considered rude. What do you expect from a handshake, Mike?
Certainly, in Western cultures, a fingertip or a weak handshake would generally give out a rather negative signal, a lack of conviction or status maybe. Even women, certainly in business situations, use a strong handshake to establish some degree of authority and credibility. But it's interesting what you said earlier, Elisa, because I noticed that you have a very strong handshake for an Asian woman.
Yes, I do, and I'm known for it. I've been told all the time that I have a very firm grip and that it gives out confidence. I think it's very important. Your handshake tells a lot about you. You can choose how you want people to think of you, especially in business.
Well, this chapter on handshakes from one of my training manuals might interest you then. The first thing to remember is that by being the initiator of a handshake, you can, to a certain extent at least, control the direction of the interaction which will follow. There may be occasions when that might not be appropriate. If you're meeting your superior, for example, you might just want to hold back. But on the whole, it's worth trying to control things if you can, or at least not putting yourself into a position where you're being controlled. There are literally thousands of minute adjustments which can be made in a handshake, but I'm just going to put them into four basic sections. The position of your hand, the firmness of the grip, the position of your body, and what you do with your left hand. In the introduction to these films, I talked to you about keeping your hands open or closed. Now, the position of your hand when you go to shake someone else's is very significant. By opening your palm slightly, it makes you more open, warm, and honest. I know of one very successful salesman who always greets his new clients in this way. And you've probably guessed it. When the sale is completed and the deal is done, his hand is much more closed. I don't think it's cynical. It's not saying the deal's been done and you've been done as well. The closed handshake is simply a way of suggesting security and permanence. Greeting a new client in that way would probably send a little message that the meeting is not going to be very warm and open. And of course, there are plenty of occasions when you may be going into that sort of situation and want to indicate that with a closed gesture, but probably not if you're trying to sell something. A weak fingertip handshake is a real no-no. It always feels wet and horrible. And an excessively firm one can be unpleasant and uncomfortable. And men, it's worth remembering when you're shaking hands with a lady, don't grip too firmly. Beware also of making too many up and down hand movements. 3 seems to be the norm. Exaggerated enthusiasm in a handshake is rather unappealing. The position of the body is absolutely crucial. You don't want to invade the other person's personal space unless you're going to kiss them as well. And you need to make that decision before you commit to the handshake, otherwise you'll be bumping all over the place. And avoid the rigid arm handshake. Okay, so this is probably all pretty obvious stuff. The mistake that is so easy to make is to break that special moment of a handshake by moving away too quickly afterwards. And we've all shaken hands with somebody who's already looking over your shoulder at someone else to shake hands with. So we know how insulting that can be. So what do you do with your left hand? Well, in most cases, probably nothing at all. It's all about finding the right handshake for the right occasion and being prepared to make those tiny adjustments to ensure that you're projecting yourself exactly as you want to be seen right from the initial greeting. Don't underestimate the significance of a handshake. And if you're shaking hands with a group of people, don't leave someone out. So in most Western cultures, eye contact whilst shaking hands is very important. Is that the same?
From the beginning, we're hardwired for it. The desire to travel, to seek out new experiences.
I want to go to France, Italy, China, Australia.
And find new firsts. IHG Rewards Club and our members have always been about firsts. And we just reached a new one together. The enrollment of our 100 millionth member. That's a lot of warm welcomes and new experiences over the years. Tell us about your favorite travel firsts, and let us help you discover the next one. Because there's always another first.
Generally, yes, but staring in some Asian cultures can be considered rude. Certain Asian countries are extremely reserved, and certain Asian cultures are extremely respectful of the elderly. So what you may find when you shake hands with someone is that they may just look at you briefly and look away, especially if you're older or if you're of a higher position.
What I find particularly interesting in the cultural differences in body language is exactly how and when you should adapt what's considered to be the norm in your own culture if you're meeting or doing business with someone from a different culture. I think the most important thing is having an awareness of those differences. Most people make an effort to learn the basics of the verbal language when they're traveling and working abroad. So surely it makes sense to learn the non-verbal language as well? At the very least, it shows respect.
Personal space is also extremely important in Asia. You don't want to invade somebody's space. If I remember correctly, you also have something to share with us on personal space, Mike?
Yes, I do. We talk about proxemics, that's the posh word for personal space. Now, we all carry around with us a bubble of space which is ours, and we don't want other people to come into it unless we invite them in. And because, of course, nobody ever says, come into my personal space, all the invitations are done through body language. Now, there's a difference in size of that bubble when you're talking to someone on a business level, a social level, a personal level, or an intimate level. We all know how uncomfortable it is if somebody gets too close to you and you think it's inappropriate. And of course, if somebody stands too far away from you while you're trying to converse with them, well, that's uncomfortable as well. And of course, the really interesting thing is that the bubble that people carry around with them differs in size from culture to culture. As you rightly say, Elisa, Asians tend to give more space than Westerners do. And my daughter's just returned from a trip to Australia, and she commented on the fact that Australians tend to give each other quite a lot of personal space as well.
Mike, if you were to work in Asia, let's say especially in Singapore, could you give us some ideas of what you would call the whole body listening?
Being a good listener is so important, not just in business, but in your social and personal relationships. You need to make sure that you're not moving around too much when you're listening. In fact, the only part of your body that really should be moving is your head as you nod. And you should make sure that you're facing the person you're speaking to. Now, we refer to body language leakage when a part of your body is revealing the truth about the way that you're feeling. So, for example, if I'm talking to you and my feet are pointing away from you, it might be leaking the fact that I'm actually wanting to head off in the direction that my feet are pointing.
That's interesting because we're back to the cultural differences in body language again. It's considered rude in Asia to point your feet at someone. And so what you may find is people may not be sitting opposite each other, pointing their feet at each other. Would this then be mistaken as not listening with your whole body?
Well, not necessarily. You can never rely on one body language signal on its own. You need to look for what I refer to as body language bundles. Sometimes you need to identify up to 4 things before you can make an accurate assessment of what somebody might be thinking or feeling. So if somebody is showing plenty of good listening signals, the fact that their feet are pointing away from you might not be that significant.
Another commonly mistaken body language gesture I see all the time in Asia is arms folding. In Asia, people tend to fold their arms because they're cold or because they don't know what to do with their arms or their hands. I've done sessions where 10 to 20 participants had their arms folded for 15 minutes. Not that they were being defensive, but it's just that they didn't know what to do with their arms or that they wanted to give out the impression that they were seriously paying attention.
I think it's important to identify the difference between open and closed body language. When I'm running workshops in the UK, I point out that although we often fold our arms because it's comfortable, it does create a perceived barrier between you and whoever you are trying to communicate with. Notice that, as soon as I do this, that your perception of me is likely to change. Maybe if it's only in a very small way. And of course the other thing is when we fold our arms, we tend to hide our hands, and our hands give us credibility. Liars often hide their hands, so I think it's really important to try and make sure that your hands are always on view.
Eye contact is also very important for me, but I also know people with very poor eye contact skills. Not only is it bad for their business, but it also gives out the wrong impression about them. In Asia, if you have poor eye contact, people always perceive you as having low self-confidence or being a snob. There are people with poor eye contact who do not look at anyone, and there are people who always end up staring. Can you give us some tips on that?
Well, the first thing to remember is that in any conversation, the speaker often breaks eye contact, and that's perfectly normal. We glance away as we're trying to think of the correct words to express ourselves, or if we're recording a memory or accessing our imagination or something like that. Now, the listener tends to maintain eye contact for almost the whole time. Now, if you're listening and following that rule, you may think that you're beginning to stare, but if that's the case, it's probably because the muscles around your face aren't relaxed. So you can tilt your head slightly on one side, that's very non-aggressive, and ensure that some gentle head nodding is going on. That will all help enormously.
It's all fascinating, Mike, and I'm sure we can go on discussing this forever. Can you give us one final tip?
Okay, you mentioned earlier about people not knowing what to do with their hands. When we want to be perceived as being warm and friendly, we should try and ensure that the palms of our hands are always on view. And when we want to increase the gravitas, we turn them the other way. Now, these are only tiny adjustments, but they're very, very useful when you're talking to a lot of people or delivering a presentation.
Thanks, Mike.